The cry came sharp through the marble halls, a sound that didn't belong in the silence of Damien Vale's mansion. Amara paused, her hand tightening around the cleaning rag she had been wringing out in the laundry sink. She was only a temporary maid, brought in by the agency to help while the regular staff rotated schedules. She had been told in no uncertain terms to stay in her lane, to clean and leave, but something about that cry cut through the instructions. It wasn't just a sound. It was the kind of sound her younger brother, Jerome, used to make when the world became too much for him. She moved quickly, slipping past the wide staircase that swept like an elegant ribbon up into the higher floors. The voice carried her toward a half-open door at the end of the corridor. Inside, the lights were dim, curtains drawn tight. She stepped inside cautiously and saw a boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, curled on the floor, fists pressed hard against his ears, as if the very air was trying to crush him. His body rocked forward and back, his breathing ragged, his small chest rising and falling too fast. Her heart squeezed. She didn't need to be told who he was. Noah Vale, the reclusive, nonverbal son of Damien Vale, the billionaire CEO, whose name meant either fortune or fear, depending on who spoke it. Noah's world was one most people couldn't understand, but Amara did. She crouched a few feet away, lowering herself until she was almost at his level, careful not to crowd him. Her voice was soft, the way one speaks to a trembling bird. It's okay, little one. You're safe. But words weren't always the bridge. Jerome had taught her that, though he had never spoken a word in his life. Slowly, she lifted her hands and began to move her fingers, forming shapes in the dim light. Breathe. Calm. You are safe. The boy's eyes snapped up, wide with tears, but something in the familiar motions made him hesitate. His rocking slowed, just a fraction, but it was enough to give her hope. She kept going, each sign slow and deliberate, her gestures flowing like a gentle rhythm. Noah's breathing evened, his tiny fingers twitching, then lifting as though testing the air. He formed a shaky sign back. Safe. Amara's throat tightened. She nodded, smiling gently, signing back, yes. Safe. The tension that had bound his small frame seemed to loosen. His fists unclenched, and instead of curling tighter into himself, he shifted toward her, inch by inch, until his forehead brushed against her knee. It was trust in its purest form, fragile, unspoken, profound. Amara's eyes burned with tears she didn't dare let fall. She stroked his hair lightly, the way she used to do for Jerome when storms rattled their windows at night. You've got this, she whispered. It's okay to feel scared. But you're not alone. The words weren't just for him. They were for herself, too. She didn't realize she was being watched until a sharp intake of breath cut the silence. She looked up quickly, and there, framed by the doorway like a shadow and a storm, stood Damien Vale. His tailored suit looked out of place against the vulnerability of the scene. His eyes were hard, ice carved into steel, but beneath that armor, there was something else: confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. What? His voice thundered, low but shaking. Are you doing in here? Amara froze. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't been called. She had simply walked into the private chamber of the most powerful man in the city and touched what was most sacred to him. I heard him, she said quickly, rising slowly, careful not to jar Noah, who was still clinging to her skirt. He was in distress. I couldn't ignore it. Damien's eyes flicked to his son. Noah, usually unreachable, usually resistant to touch, was holding on to this stranger as though she were the only steady ground left in his collapsing world. Something cracked across Damien's face, but his words came cold, automatic, a shield against the ache he couldn't name. You had no right. You are staff. Your job is to clean, not to meddle. Amara met his gaze. She should have bowed her head, apologized, and begged to keep her job. But something about the boy's hand, still gripping her skirt, gave her a strange courage. I know my place, she said softly, but I also know what it feels like to be that child. My brother was like him. And sometimes, words don't reach, but hands do. If you fire me, so be it. But please don't scold him for letting me in. Her honesty struck something in him. Damien looked again at his son, who now glanced between them, his small face calmer, his breathing steady. The billionaire, who had stared down boardrooms and crushed competitors, suddenly felt like the weakest man alive. His throat worked as if he wanted to argue, but the words refused to come. Instead, silence stretched. Finally, his voice broke, quieter now. What did you do? Amara bent down, showing the simple signs again. Sign language. My brother, Jerome, was autistic. He taught me to listen without ears, to speak without a tongue. Noah just needed someone to meet him where he is, not where the world insists he should be. Damien's hand clenched by his side, the controlled mask slipping just for a heartbeat. Grief flickered there, raw and unhidden, before it sealed shut again. He exhaled slowly. Stay, he said at last, his voice rough. Not as a maid. Stay for him. Amara blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Damien said, eyes fixed on his son who now leaned against her, calmer than Damien had seen in months. Be his caretaker. His anchor. Whatever it is you just did, he needs that. I can pay more than the agency. Just stay. The offer was staggering, but Amara didn't think of money first. She thought of her grandmother Loretta, lying in her small apartment, prescriptions lined up like silent sentinels. She thought of the rent overdue notice, of the late-night panic in her chest when she wondered if tomorrow would break them completely. She looked down at Noah, then up at Damien. I'll stay, she said quietly. For him. For a moment. The man who owned half the city seemed almost human, his guarded face softening, his gaze lingering not on Amara but on the fragile boy between them. Something stirred in him, something he had thought buried with his late wife. And though he turned quickly, his voice brisk, his shoulders stiff, Amara caught the truth in his eyes before he could hide it. The billionaire's heart had stirred. Life in the Vale mansion shifted almost overnight. Amara was no longer just the temporary maid who swept corners no one noticed. She became the center of Noah's small world. Every morning, she was there before he woke, her hands ready to guide him into the day with gentle signs and a calm voice. At first, Damien hovered from the background, arms folded, skepticism carved into every line of his posture. But as days bled into weeks, he could not deny what unfolded before his eyes. His son laughed more, panicked less, and reached toward someone other than his father for the first time since Emma's death. Noah's progress was not sudden fireworks, but slow, steady lanterns flickering one by one. Amara celebrated each small moment as though it were gold when he made eye contact longer than 2 seconds, when he signed hungry instead of pushing his plate away, when he reached for his shoes without resistance. These moments built into something bigger, a rhythm of hope that began to echo through the cold halls of the mansion. Damien watched, at first in disbelief, then in reluctant admiration, until the barrier he had built around himself began to fracture. One evening, after a long day of tense boardroom battles, he found himself in the kitchen, leaning against the counter while Amara prepared a snack for Noah. It wasn't a chef plating gourmet meals. It was Amara cutting apples into small cubes and sprinkling cinnamon on top, explaining in a quiet, amused tone that cinnamon had been her brother's bravery spice. Bravery spice? Damien asked, raising an eyebrow. She smiled faintly, eyes warm with memory. Jerome hated new foods. But if I sprinkled cinnamon, he believed it gave him courage. He'd eat anything with it, even broccoli. For the first time in months, Damien chuckled a short, rough sound that startled them both. Noah, sitting at the table, looked up and tilted his head at the unfamiliar sound. Then he signed something small but clear, happy. Amara's eyes softened, but it was Damien who felt the words spear through him. His son had just described him as happy, and for once, it was true. But peace has a way of drawing storms. It began subtly. A journalist sniffing around for stories, questions whispered about the maid-turned-caretaker, comments online hinting that Damien Vale was compromising his empire with sentiment. Damien ignored them, but Amara felt the eyes, sharp and judgmental, every time she stepped outside with Noah. She had never cared about public opinion. Her world had always been survival, not headlines, but here, she was exposed, dragged into the orbit of a man whose name never left the business pages. The storm broke when Child Welfare Services appeared at the mansion. 2 officials, stiff in their suits, arrived unannounced one morning, flashing badges and polite but pointed smiles. We received an anonymous complaint, one of them said, voice too smooth to be kind. Concerns about Noah's care, potential unqualified individuals acting in roles beyond their scope. Amara's stomach dropped. Damien's face hardened instantly, jaw clenching as though he could grind the threat into dust. Anonymous. His tone was venom. Do you mean fabricated? Or should I believe every baseless whisper gets you at my door? The officials remained unmoved, their questions directed at Amara as though she were on trial in her own kitchen. What were her qualifications? Why had she been hired outside a medical board? Did she understand the complexity of caring for a nonverbal autistic child? She answered with steady honesty. She wasn't certified, no, but she had lived it with her brother, her late nights learning signs, her years of navigating a world that rarely bent to children like Jerome or Noah. And more importantly, the proof stood quietly at her side. Noah reached for her hand during the interrogation, his small fingers lacing through hers, his eyes calm where once they would have been frantic. The officials took notes, unreadable. When they finally left, Damien slammed the door with such force the chandelier rattled. This isn't a coincidence, he muttered, pacing like a caged animal. This is Lark Technologies. They've been trying to gut my company for years, and now they've found the one place I'm vulnerable. My son. Amara had heard of Lark, a rival corporation known for underhanded tactics, but she hadn't realized the war stretched into Damien's private life. You think they filed the complaint? She asked. I don't think, he growled. I know. That night, Amara found Damien alone in his study, whiskey untouched at his side, his head buried in his hands. The mask of the untouchable CEO had fallen, and what remained was a man frayed at the edges. You don't have to fight this alone, she said softly from the doorway. His head snapped up, eyes blazing. It's my war, my family, my responsibility. She crossed the room, her steps slow but unflinching. Then let it be our responsibility. You said it yourself, no one needs me. Well, so do you. Stop pushing everyone out, Damien. You can't build walls high enough to keep pain away. It just leaks through the cracks. For a long moment, he just stared at her, as though no one had dared speak to him that way in years. Finally, his shoulders sagged, the fight draining. He whispered, Emmy used to tell me the same thing. The name hung in the air, delicate and heavy. His late wife's ghost lived everywhere in this house, in the untouched piano, in the photographs lining the hall. Damien rarely spoke of her, but tonight, he let the memories slip. She took him to the Railroad Museum every Saturday, he murmured, eyes distant. Noah loved it. After she died, I couldn't go back. It felt like betraying her memory, like I'd be erasing her. Amara sat across from him, her voice gentle. Or maybe it's honoring her, keeping the things she loved alive for him. For both of you. For the first time, Damien's eyes softened not just with grief, but with something else. Gratitude, perhaps, or the dangerous beginnings of trust. He studied her face, this woman who had entered his home by accident and somehow became the light in his son's darkness. The weeks that followed were fragile, but filled with small victories. Damien began learning sign language himself, clumsy at first, his fingers stiff and awkward, but Noah's delighted laughter kept him trying. Amara was there beside him, guiding his hands, correcting gently, and in those moments, Damien felt closer to his son than he had in years. But the outside world did not relent. Tabloids ran headlines about the maid-turned-nanny, painting Amara as an opportunist sinking her claws into a billionaire. Lark Technologies fueled the rumors, whispering to investors that Damien's judgment was compromised. The investigation from Child Services deepened, threatening hearings and custody reviews. Through it all, Amara stood steady. She had faced poverty, loss, and judgment before, but nothing compared to protecting Noah. She reminded Damien, again and again, that they could weather this if they stayed united. And slowly, their partnership became something more than a contract of convenience, but a bond formed in late-night confessions, shared laughter, and the unspoken rhythm of raising a child together. Still, the storm built toward its breaking point, a battle neither of them could avoid. The whispers had grown teeth, and now the system itself was calling them to court. The courthouse smelled of varnish and nerves, its high ceilings echoing with voices that carried judgment long before the gavel fell. Amara walked beside Damien, her hand brushing Noah's shoulder as he clutched a small toy train in his palm. He hated noise, hated strangers, but today he faced both. She whispered to him in signs as they moved down the corridor. Safe. With me. Always. He nodded once, pressing closer, and for a fleeting second she forgot the eyes of the world on them. Damien, in his charcoal suit, looked every inch the billionaire CEO who could bend markets with a word, but Amara had learned to see beyond that armor. His hand twitched as though he wanted to reach for Noah, but stopped, his fear of failure still heavy in his chest. She squeezed his arm lightly and whispered, "You've got this." He met her gaze, something unspoken flickering in his eyes, gratitude, maybe even something deeper. Inside the courtroom, the air was different, colder, hungrier. Lark Technologies had sent their lawyers, sleek men with sharper smiles than knives. They weren't here for Noah's well-being. They were here to wound Damien through his son, through Amara, through the one place money could not shield him. The judge, a woman with kind but stern eyes, called the session to order. The opposing counsel began, painting a picture of recklessness. A billionaire so blinded by grief, he handed his fragile child to an unqualified maid. They used words like irresponsible and dangerous, layering their accusations with veiled contempt. Amara sat silently at first, her hands tight in her lap, each word clawing at her skin. But she felt Noah lean against her side, and she knew she couldn't stay silent forever. When it was her turn, she rose. Her dress was simple, nothing like the polished suits around her, but her voice carried the weight of truth. "I am not certified," she admitted plainly. "I don't hold degrees or framed papers. But I hold something else, a lifetime of living with and loving someone the world misunderstood. My late brother, Jerome, was autistic. He couldn't speak with words, but he spoke with his hands, his eyes, his heart. I learned his language because the world refused to. And when I saw Noah struggling, I recognized that same storm. I didn't fix him because he was never broken. I simply listened." Her words hung in the silence, and for once even the polished lawyers had no immediate response. Amara turned toward the judge, her voice steady but laced with quiet fire. "Noah has made progress not because I forced him into molds he doesn't fit, but because I let him be who he is. He trusts me because I show up. Day after day. I don't leave when it's hard. I stay. And that's what care is. That's what love is." Damien's throat tightened, pride and ache twisting together. He had faced rivals, scandals, even the death of his wife, but nothing moved him like watching Amara stand there, not as his employee, not as his shield, but as the anchor his son needed. The courtroom murmured, whispers rippling. The judge leaned forward, her eyes on Noah, who clutched his toy tightly. For a moment, it seemed the boy might retreat into himself under the weight of so many strangers watching. But then, as though sensing the moment, he looked up at Damien. His lips parted, sound rough and unused, but clear enough to pierce through every wall in the room. "Dada." The world froze. Damien's eyes widened, his chest convulsing as if the word had broken something open inside him. It was the first spoken word Noah had offered in 2 years, and it wasn't to Amara, not to the court, but to his father. Tears burned behind Damien's eyes, and he knelt instinctively, arms opening as Noah shuffled into them. "Yes," Damien whispered hoarsely, clutching his son close. "Dada's here. Always." Then, like a soft echo, Noah turned his gaze toward Amara. His lips formed again, shaky but determined. "Ma!" Gasps filled the courtroom, but Amara didn't hear them. Her heart crashed against her ribs, her knees weakening as Noah reached out a hand toward her. She bent quickly, pressing her forehead against his, her tears dampening his hair. "Yes, baby. Ma's here." The judge cleared her throat, visibly moved, though her voice remained formal. "This court finds no evidence of neglect or misconduct. On the contrary, it is clear Noah thrives under Miss Amara's care. Case dismissed." The gavel fell, but for Damien, the real judgment had already been given in a single word from his son's lips. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions about scandals and romance. Damien ignored them all, shielding Noah with one arm, while the other guided Amara through the chaos. They made it to the car, and when the door shut, silence wrapped around them. Damien turned to her, his voice raw. "I named you in my will today." Amara blinked, stunned. "What?" "As Noah's guardian," he explained, his gaze unflinching. "If anything happens to me, he'll have you. I won't let him ever lose the one person who understands him this way." Emotions surged through her, too vast for words. She wanted to protest, to say she wasn't worthy, but Noah's small hand slipped into hers, sealing the truth. From that day forward, life reshaped itself. The threats from Lark didn't vanish, but they no longer held the same power. Damien and Amara faced them together, their bond stronger than corporate wars. Amara was soon invited to serve on the state's Child Welfare Advisory Board, her testimony having stirred more than one heart in that courtroom. She accepted, not for prestige, but for children like Noah and Jerome who needed voices to F. Damien learned to cook clumsy pancakes on Sunday mornings. Amara teased him about his terrible sign for thank you. And Noah, though still navigating his storms, no longer faced them alone. On a quiet evening, Damien stood on the balcony with Amara, the city glowing beneath them. He slipped his hand into hers. No grand speeches, no rehearsed charm, just a man stripped of his armor. "You turn my house into a home," he said quietly. "Stay? Not as his caretaker. Not as an employee. Stay as ours." Amara's eyes filled, her lips trembling into a smile. "I was never leaving." And so, the billionaire who thought he could buy everything learned the truth that the rarest treasure was not wealth, but the family built from patience, trust, and love. Moral lesson: love is not found in perfection, but in presence. Amara showed that caring is not about titles or degrees, but about showing up, staying, and listening with the heart. Damien discovered that strength is not in walls, but in vulnerability. And Noah, with his first words, reminded them all that trust is a seed that blooms when watered with patience. Families are not bound only by blood, but by those who choose to stay when the storms come. If this story touched you, like this video, subscribe for more, share it with friends, and comment your lesson below.